For those of you I don't know, I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation, and thank you very much for joining us today. I also want to say hello to the folks watching on the internet live today. We're streaming many more of these events live, and it's fun. I'm probably going to list the flags of nations sometimes of people doing it, but we've got people all over the world watching with us today. I have the pleasure of introducing the newly confirmed on June 10th Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, James Glassman. Jim, as many of you know, has been a public policy entrepreneur and sort of a player in Washington for years. He is really you know, I get in trouble sometimes in my introductions, but one of the cooler people in this town because he's so entrepreneurial. I haven't seen him in a role that he hasn't blurred in really creative ways. And I used to tell people there were a couple of folks I really learned from and sort of modeled my own blurriness with and testing of boundaries and various things. And Jim Glassman was one. When I worked for Senator Jeff Bingaman in the 1990s, Jim was then the anchor of a television show that focused on technology. And Jim was not the greatest fan of a package that I had ghostwritten for my boss called the Senate High Wage Jobs Task Force, Democratic High Wage Jobs Task Force, and some various initiatives in it. And I think Jim sort of thought it bordered on communism. But it was a really cool, principled, civil discussion. And I got email about it for a long time, but it brought me right up front and square with how Jim Glassman operates. We had different views, we engaged each other, it was civil and fun, and we've been friends and connected on a whole variety of projects for years and years. Jim has been, until recently, chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors. I assume you're not anymore, right? You had to give that up because undue influence, blurring of lines, etc. He did give that up. But he has been editor-in-chief and executive publisher of The American, affiliated with the American Enterprise Institute. In a very interesting way, he's been sort of a publisher of nearly every publication in Washington, from U.S. News and World Report. He was president of the Atlantic Monthly, publisher of the New Republic, executive editor of the Washingtonian. I don't see it here, but I think he was co-owner, involved in Roll Call, a whole variety of publications. He is a person who sits at the nexus between publishing, generating intellectual ideas, working in the for-profit arena as well, and I've enjoyed knowing him. And I think in his role, which he took over on June 10th as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, regardless of whether people are fans or not of the Bush administration, it is a vital, vital need to help figure out new ways to promote engagement in abroad, to look at the terms of that and to deal with real challenges. And public diplomacy is a very key part of that portfolio. I think that we've always needed somebody like a Jim Glassman in that role, and I hope that we find other people like him. There aren't many. We don't promote the kind of entrepreneurial policy activist that Jim Glassman has been. So without further ado, let me introduce Jim Glassman, who's going to say a few words about new approaches to winning the war of ideas, and then I'll help moderate a discussion afterwards. So, Jim Glassman.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, you're so kind. I've probably been here at New America, I think 5 or 6 times, talking in many different subjects, and this is my favorite. I should also say that I didn't remember what the topic was that we discussed with Senator Bingaman, but high-wage jobs, I'm all in favor of that, right? Nothing wrong with that. That's not communistic. Steve, congratulations on your many successes, and including the Washington Note, and I was happy to see last night that someone had posted some sort of fairly nasty comment about me. It's hard to believe. And Steve defended me immediately, so I was happy to see that. Let me also say that apropos of your comments about partisanship, I certainly viewed my job as chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and now, by the way, I continue to sit on the board as the Secretary of State's representative, one of the 9 governors. I certainly saw that as a nonpartisan job, and I said that right from the start in my first talk to the governors. And I believe that's true as well for public diplomacy. I think public diplomacy is an area where certainly there are some differences, but in general, this is something that, that everyone can get behind, and on which I think there are actually very few differences. But we'll see, because I'm going to talk about that today. Public diplomacy is very simply diplomacy that's aimed at publics as opposed to officials. While some people associate public diplomacy with a kind of a beauty contest, the truth is that public diplomacy, like official diplomacy, and like what the Defense Department likes to call it kinetic actions when they become necessary, has as its mission the achievement of the national interest. Public diplomacy performs this mission by understanding, informing, engaging, and influencing foreign publics. That's what we do. And ultimately, it is the last word, influencing or persuading, that counts the most. Our aim in public diplomacy is to influence foreign publics to make it easier to achieve U.S. foreign policy goals, both short-term and long-term. And the key goals today, these should come as no surprise, are to diminish the threat to Americans and the rest of the world posed by violent extremism and weapons of mass destruction, and to help people around the world achieve freedom. These goals are linked, according to the National Security Strategy. Championing freedom advances our interests because the survival of liberty at home increasingly depends on the success of liberty abroad. Free countries tend not to make war on other free countries because the people who have a stake in making those decisions don't want it. Public diplomacy has a great tradition. During the Cold War, after a slow start, we became very good at it with such institutions as the Congress of Cultural Freedom, the USIA, Radio Free Europe. But starting in the early 1990s, the United States, in a bipartisan fashion, began to dismantle this arsenal of persuasion. Today, I'm happy to report the environment has changed. Budgets have risen, backing is bipartisan. One of the biggest enthusiasts for public diplomacy in government is the Secretary of Defense. As Robert Gates said just last week, over the long term, we cannot kill or capture our way to victory. Non-military efforts, these tools of persuasion and inspiration, were indispensable to the outcome of the defining struggle of the 20th century. They are just as indispensable in the 21st century, and for perhaps, he said, even more so. There are four parts of our public diplomacy effort: education and cultural affairs, mainly exchange programs. These are our crown jewels and where the majority of the State Department's public diplomacy funding goes. This year, despite tighter visa requirements since 9/11, a record 600,000 foreign students will come to the United States to study. We are by far the most popular learning destination in the world. And I should add that about 250,000 Americans will go abroad to study. And it is these programs that put Americans face to face with people around the world that, according to our evaluations, are the most effective. The problem is they tend to be quite expensive to pursue, but right now we are bringing about 50,000 foreigners to the United States in our programs. And a big increase, by the way, 50% increase over the last few years. Second, international information programs, which tell America's story through speakers, publications, and a robust internet presence. And I want to emphasize that our aim is not to preach, but to encourage interaction that will lead to understanding of American principles and policies. Our credo in information dissemination is summed up in the National Security Strategy. Freedom cannot be imposed, it must be chosen. And in that regard, we are using the most modern internet techniques, including Web 2.0 techniques that provide social networking. So what we want to do is create a conversation with the confidence that this conversation will lead to the kind of results that are best not just for American interests, but for the world. Third, U.S. international broadcasting, which is overseen by an independent board. It's not part of the State Department. I used to chair the board, and which over the past 8 years has increased its weekly audience by 75%, from 100 million to 175 million. It's a major accomplishment during a period when, I don't have to tell you, America's popularity in the world has declined, or certainly has not increased, but the audience of U.S. international broadcasting has increased by a significant degree. And finally, fourth, the war of ideas, which is what I want to talk to you about today. The Undersecretary has two hats. I run the part of public diplomacy that resides at the State Department and that I just described to you, and by presidential directive, I lead the government-wide effort in the war of ideas, and that interagency effort includes coordination with the State Department, with the Defense Department, USAID, the National Security Council, the intelligence community, and the private sector, as well as other government agencies. Senator Joe Lieberman, when he introduced me at my confirmation hearing, which I'm kind of embarrassed to say took place back in December, and I was not confirmed in the end until June. He said at that hearing that I was the supreme Allied commander in the war of ideas. It's kind of grandiose, and we haven't told the Allies that this is true. But certainly, the focus on the war of ideas is my focus, and more constituents are interested. Let's put it that way. The focus of today's war of ideas is counterterrorism. As the National Strategy for Combating Terrorism of 2006 puts it, in the long run, winning the war on terror means winning the battle of ideas. So let me be specific. Our mission today in the war of ideas is highly focused. It is to use the tools of ideological engagement, words, deeds, and images, to create an environment hostile to violent extremism. We want to break the linkages between groups like al-Qaeda and their target audiences. There's been much activity in the war of ideas throughout the government over the past few years, including at the State Department under my predecessor, Karen Hughes. What has been lacking has been focus and emphasis. In the war of ideas, we are placing the emphasis not on enticing foreigners to like us more, but on defeating an ideology. How important are ideas? How important is ideology? The violent extremists themselves certainly think that ideology is important. Al-Qaeda makes a huge effort on the internet and in training camps to indoctrinate young recruits. Bin Laden said back in 2004, "The struggle is an ideological and religious challenge. Muslims are the ones who have the ideology, the will, and the ability to resist their plans," their meaning the enemy's plans, "fight their injustice, and fight them back." An ideological and religious challenge, says Bin Laden. How do we approach this pernicious and powerful ideology? Unlike traditional functions of public diplomacy like education and cultural exchanges, the aim of the war of ideas is not to persuade foreign populations to adopt more favorable views of the United States and its policies. Instead, the war of ideas tries to ensure that the negative sentiments and day-to-day grievances toward the United States and its allies do not manifest themselves in the form of violent extremism. Let me put this another way. In the war of ideas, our core task is not how to fix foreigners' perceptions of the United States. Those perceptions are important. Let there be no doubt about that. They are important because they help us secure our national interests. So they're important. But America's popularity is a very complex issue that has often been treated as simplistic. And more important, the key is that America's image, indeed the United States itself, is not at the center of the war of ideas. So we can accomplish a great deal even as allies of people who don't necessarily like our policies or have other reasons to not like the United States. Instead, we recognize that there is a complex, multi-sided battle going on in Muslim societies for power. This is a battle in which we cannot be a bystander if we wanted to. This battle within Muslim societies for power affects the United States directly and was responsible for the deaths of 3,000 people 7 years ago. In this battle, our main role is to support constructive alternatives to violent extremism. Because the battle is going on within Muslim societies, our role is complicated and requires that we ourselves not do much of the fighting. More and more credible Muslim voices are speaking out, and they are having an impact. Just a few examples. Last year, one of bin Laden's most prominent Saudi mentors, Salman al-Wada, publicly reproached him for spreading mayhem. How many innocent children, elderly people, and women have been killed in the name of al-Qaeda, he wrote. How many people have been forced to flee their homes, and how much blood has been shed in the name of al-Qaeda. Influential Egyptian sociologist Saad Eddin Ibrahim also has turned on al-Qaeda. The slogan first raised by the Muslim Brotherhood years ago, Islam is the solution, has been transformed into a reality in which the Muslims who applied the slogan have become the problem, he says. They use it to kill fellow Muslims. Thus, al-Qaeda in the land of the two rivers, Iraq, has killed 10 times more Iraqi Muslims than invading Americans, he says. Most dramatic, perhaps, is the case of Dr. Fadl, the nom de guerre of Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, a key architect of al-Qaeda's ideology, who turned apostate. A piece by Lawrence Wright, who wrote The Looming Tower, last month in The New Yorker, told this story. Here is Dr. Fadl today. We are prohibited, he writes, from committing aggression even if the enemies of Islam do that, he writes. Oh, you young people, do not be deceived by the heroes of the internet, the leaders of the microphones, who are launching statements inciting the youth while living under the protection of intelligence services or of a tribe or in a distant cave or under political asylum in an infidel country. They have thrown many others before you into infernos, graves, and prisons. That is the author of much of the founding ideology of al-Qaeda. These dramatic ideological reversals follow the remarkable success of the awakening in Al-Anbar province, where U.S. casualties declined from 356 in 2006 to 161 in 2007 to 21 so far this year. Colonel Sean McFarland, the hero of the awakening, put it this way: the prize in the counterinsurgency fight is not terrain, it's the people. When you've secured the people, you have won the war. Al-Qaeda and its satellites possess the seeds of their own destruction. Peter Bergen noted in congressional testimony last year that al-Qaeda has 4 strategic weaknesses. It keeps killing Muslim civilians. It has not created a genuine mass movement. Its leaders have constantly expanded their list of enemies, and it has no positive vision. Bombings in Jordan, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia have taught this lesson. Meanwhile, kinetic action has seriously damaged the al-Qaeda leadership and infrastructure. My favorite bedtime reading lately is Clive James's book of brief profiles, sort of like eminent Victorians, called Cultural Amnesia. James writes about Edgar Quinet, a French intellectual of the 19th century, whom I admit I knew nothing about, whose famous statement about the French Revolution went like this: the persistent illusion of the terrorists, and he's writing about the French Revolution, is to invoke a success in order to justify themselves before posterity. In effect, only success can absolve them. But this success, where is it? Orwell made much the same point in response to the famous Bolshevik dictum that to make an omelet, you have to break some eggs. Orwell said, but where's the omelet? The attitudinal tide is beginning to turn. Fewer Muslims view suicide bombing as justified. The proportion supporting such activity dropped between 2002 and 2007 from 43% to 23% in Jordan, 26 to 10 in Indonesia, 44 to 20 in Bangladesh. These numbers are still disturbingly high, but there's been a dramatic decline. The proportions of Jordanians with a lot of confidence in Osama bin Laden has fallen from 56% in 2003 to 20% in 2007. In Kuwait, from 20% to 13%. But by no means is the threat of violent extremism over or even dramatically reduced. As Peter Bergen says, the rapid spread of the al-Qaeda ideological virus in the past several years should be cause for considerable concern. Because of these ideological religious beliefs and the ties to vibrant insurgencies, al-Qaeda is able to withstand multiple blows to its leadership and infrastructure of a kind that would put an ordinary criminal organization, such as a mafia crime family, out of business. That's Peter Bergen. Again, he's talking about ideology. Ideology counts. So here's our ultimate goal: a world in which the use of violence to achieve political, religious, or social objectives is not considered acceptable, where efforts to radicalize and recruit new members are no longer successful, and where the perpetrators of violent extremism are condemned and isolated. How do we achieve such a world? Two ways. First, by confronting the ideology that justifies and enables the violence. We try to remove the fake veneer on the reputation of extremists and allow publics to see the shame and hostility of life in terrorism. This is an effort that requires credible Muslim voices to work effectively. Second, we achieve our desired goal by offering, often in cooperation with the private sector and using the best technology, including Web 2.0 social networking techniques, a full range of productive alternatives to violent extremism. The shorthand for this policy is diversion, powerful and lasting diversion, the channeling of potential recruits from violence with the attractions of entertainment, culture, literature, music, technology, sports, education, business and culture, in addition to politics and religion. While winning hearts and minds would be an admirable feat, the War of Ideas adopts the more immediate and realistic goal of diverting impressionable segments of the population from the recruitment process. The War of Ideas is really a battle of alternative visions. Going beyond diversion, we seek to build counter-movements, empowering groups and individuals opposed to violent extremism. Movements using both electronic and physical means that bring people together with similar constructive interests, such as Mothers Opposed to Violence, built on the MAD, or Mothers Against Drunk Driving model, Believers in Democratic Islam, electronic gaming, video, people who make videos on their own, and we help to enable them to do that. Our role is as a facilitator of choice. We help build networks and movements. We put tools in the hands of young people to make their own choices rather than dictating their choices. Again, in the words of the National Security Strategy, freedom cannot be imposed, it must be chosen. We've already done a major reorganization, both at state and the interagency, to help in the overall effort. I will not bore you with the details of that reorganization unless you really want to hear them. But I've listed 5 focal points for our programs. Muslim society, especially involving young people at the grassroots, Middle East elites who involve themselves in ideology and religious doctrine, foreign fighters who have poured into Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan as well, Iran as a focal point, and private sector expertise. And I want to stress that we are on the lookout for measures that marry the traditional means of public diplomacy as well as private sector initiatives with the War of Ideas efforts. In addition, the War of Ideas must be broadly international. It has to extend beyond the Middle East, Latin America. It has to extend beyond the Middle East. Latin America and Africa and much of East Asia must be an important focus of our attention, along with Europe, Central Asia, and other places with high concentrations of Muslims who might be susceptible to the extremist message. And it is not just one kind of violent extremism. We are working to build networks that include victims of such groups as the FARC in Colombia, This is a long-term effort, and it is nearly impossible to pinpoint the geography of the next threat. Our work is ahead of us. Again, ideas count. There is a widespread belief in Muslim societies that the United States and other Western powers want to destroy Islam and replace it with Christianity. Surveys show 80% of people believe that. This root belief underlies much of the passive support for the violent extremism of al-Qaeda and similar groups. That's a big problem to tackle. The flow of new recruits has not stopped. In the end, the mission of 21st century public diplomacy is to tell the world of a good and compassionate nation, and at the same time to engage in the most important ideological contest of our time. This engagement must, by its nature, involve non-Americans that we nurture, support, and encourage. Our goal in this war of ideas is to create an environment hostile to violent extremism. This is a contest that we have now engaged vigorously, and it's a contest that we will win. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Let me open the floor, and I wish we could take questions from our internet audience, and we're getting there. But let me open up with one question of my own. On the subject of diversion and diversionary strategies, which I find fascinating, because to some degree what you've done is taken the whole question of America and how popular we are out of this. But there is a part of this that I'm wondering how you accomplish, because don't your non-American allies in which we are helping to provide infrastructure or video games, or it almost sounds like a city strategy to sometimes deal with getting people out of gang activity. But do you find that maybe you need to work through the Europeans or through Saudi instruments or others so that you put a buffer between the United States and these efforts because of the lack of popularity of the United States in many of these places?
Well, I just think that that we are not the credible voices here. We're just not. I think we have to. And I think we all understand that, those of us who are engaged in this. And you can say, well, maybe it's partly because of our policies. I don't think that's the main thing. I think that we are talking about an ideological struggle that involves a twisted interpretation of a religion. It's built on top of a religion. This is what makes it different from, let's say, the struggle against communism. And so the most credible voices are participants in that religion, believers in the religion, formulators of religious doctrine, interpreters of doctrine. So they're Muslims. So that's the reason that we don't participate. And I think it's true that this question of American popularity is as I said, is a very complex one. But it is absolutely true that our favorability ratings, if you want to call them that, have declined in the Middle East and in Europe. But this effort really has very, very little to do with that, even though we are certainly doing things through our long-term programs and through some of our shorter-term programs to increase not so much likability or lovability or whatever it is, but really respect and trust, I think, for the United States. And just to add to this, our allies are doing some fantastic things. The Saudis are making an amazing effort in this war of ideas on the diversionary side, as well as our European allies. And so I think that I think it's working well, and I think your point is well taken.
Great. Let me open the floor now. Some caveats in your question, Under Secretary Glassman. One of your two questions, not more than one, or I will cut you off. And please identify yourself. But let's go to Norm Kurland here real quick. Make them brief, or I will cut you off.
Yes, I'm Norm Kurland from the Center for Economic and Social Justice. I think it's a brilliant talk today, and I applaud what you're doing. I think it's a major advance. I want to make one quick comment and then make a suggestion for perhaps improving your strategy. The comment I would have is that in the war of ideas and the war of words, the word justice doesn't come out. freedom and democracy follow justice. So and I believe that it's very important in public diplomacy, particularly among Muslims, to talk about justice. The second thing is to go back to both President Reagan and his Presidential Task Force on Project Economic Justice, and Lincoln under the Homestead Acts. I want to talk about a specific problem that could help win the war of ideas, and that is oil. Who should own the oil? If you can have government owning, you can have the global oil corporations owning, or like Lincoln under the Homestead Acts, we should be proposing as an instrument of justice that every man, woman, and child can become an owner of capital for their lifetime, non-transferable, and I'd like you to consider that as a possible improvement on your public diplomacy effort.
Thank you, Norm.
Any
quick comment?
Thank you. Just a quick comment. I won't comment on the oil part, though it's an interesting idea. I completely agree with you about the use of the word justice, and I'm actually sorry that I didn't include that word in this talk. You know, in my preparation for this job, I became completely convinced that that is a very important word that really resonates among Muslim audiences, and I don't say that in a cynical way. I know, and I think it's true. And I also believe that's something that we can add in a credible way. So thank you for that point.
Mike Miyazawa. I promise to call on people I don't know too, so don't worry.
Okay, thank you. My Arab friends, all of them without a single exception, always say this: we know America, but Americans don't know us. So I guess my question is, do you have any new plan for public diplomacy in reverse direction, in addition to the ongoing exchange programs?
Thanks, Mike.
You know, in defining public diplomacy, I say it is understanding. So that's the part you're talking about: engaging, informing, influencing. So part of our job is to understand, especially Muslim societies, which we don't do a very good job of now. Let me just add one thing, Steve. Sorry, moving on to the next question.
I'm just getting the microphone pre-positioned.
Ah, good. When I was in Kuwait in December, I had a great experience. I attended what's called a diwaniyah, which is a kind of salon. That these salons are held on a regular basis at people's homes, and where the issues of the day are discussed in an informal setting. And it was originally a way of getting news around before newspapers. Anyway, I thought, you know, if I ever get confirmed, I want to do that. So I have actually started a diwaniyah in my home. And the point of it is, and we did it last month. We had seven ambassadors from Muslim nations, as well as
should let me come blog it.
Well, I think at this point we want to do it off the record. But I do think it's very revealing what's on their minds. So part of our job is really to understand what is on the minds of these societies. And you know, Americans have not, as a whole, have not been very understanding. That is to say, we haven't really known a lot. I don't think we've been antagonistic. But we just don't understand, and I think that we need to do that. So, good point.
I should mention before we go to Rob Warney that on my blog, The Washington Note, this week, there is a terrorism salon, or looking at root causes and direction on terrorism, that does involve Peter Bergen, who's a senior fellow here, Matt Levitt from the Washington Institute, Yusri Fuda from Al Jazeera, and others. And so for those of us interested in a lot of the issues that Jim Glassman raised, there is this interesting exchange that will continue to unfold over the next week on the blog. It's kind of fun. Rob Warney.
Secretary Glassman, thank you for an excellent statement. Could you use one specific example? Let's talk about Afghanistan, where I think much of the counterterrorism effort is centered today. What can the war of ideas do? We seem to have lost traction there. The Taliban seems to be spreading its influence.
Afghanistan is a big problem, and there are a number of different things we can do. Actually, in Afghanistan, one of our big problems has to do with information. Taliban is, and our other enemies in Afghanistan are very good at getting word out, sometimes inaccurately, about particular events on the ground, much quicker than we have been. And so we are moving as quickly as we can to remedy that. One of the things that Karen Hughes started, and it was a fantastic innovation. You would think this might have been in place beforehand, but were regional media hubs that were set up in London, Brussels, and Dubai. When I was in Dubai, I met with Michael Pelletier, who runs our hub there. At any rate, we are almost certainly going to be opening a similar kind of media hub in Kabul. But it's not just that; it's also some of the programs that I've talked about that we already have already begun to institute and will be doing more. But it's a big problem, and it's a big problem when things. Well, let me stop right there.
Fine. Lots of questions until Sam, go to who I give it to when I tell you. But yes, go ahead right here this time.
Samah Norquist with Global Partners.
Samah. Hello. Yes.
Undersecretary Glassman, thank you very much for your presentation. I want to commend you for something that, as a Muslim American, haven't heard from a lot of people from this administration, which is separating the Islamic faith from terrorism, and I really commend you for doing that. My question to you goes to your opening statement about public diplomacy as an area that everyone could get behind, and sort of follow up on a previous question about the two-way public diplomacy between Americans and Arabs or Muslims. I think there's an immense misunderstanding and misinformation about the Middle East here in the United States. And I know you talked about us understanding as a U.S. government and ambassadorial level on better understanding of the Middle East. But from a personal view, I think there's a lot of work for you to do on the American people level with the Middle East. Most of your efforts deals with people in the Middle East. I think you should focus also on getting more American people engaged in efforts that you're trying to do in that area.
Well, I completely agree with you, but a lot of that has to be done by the private sector. For example, I have heard many complaints about how the media portray people in the Middle East, how our media portray. I've got some complaints about the way our media portray Americans as well. But you know, that's not something. I'm not about to go to Hollywood and tell them to change their policies. But I do think or change their scripts. But I do think that that's a major. It is a major issue. What we do is on a people-to-people basis. In other words, a few weeks ago, I had the great pleasure of addressing a graduating class of 300 students, young people in their teens, who came to the United States and lived with American families. This is a program we called YES. Brought them over from Indonesia, Egypt, Thailand, mostly Muslims, but not all Muslims. And coming from Cairo to live in Chester, Vermont for a year. And that works both ways. I mean, they learn from Americans, but I think probably more so Americans learn from them. That the whole high school, they go to public high school. So let me also just say thank you for your kind comments. Islam is a great religion. What's happened is a rather small but dangerous and powerful group has hijacked a part of that religion and twisted it to their own ends in a power struggle. And that is the way that I view what's happened, and I think that it certainly is the way that people who are engaged in this effort with me view it. So,
lots of questions out there, and we have plenty of time. But Rudiger Lenz with Deutsche Welle over here, Bob Hutchings next, Howard LaFranchi of Christian Science Monitor, and then I'll do this gentleman here who's been animated. And you're next. Right. Yes.
Thank you, Steve. Rudiger Lenz, Deutsche Welle, Washington. I have a question concerning your strategy. It sounded very militaristic to me. It was like a military strategy. Divide the goods from the bad, hunt the bad, separate them, and then be successful. You avoided, not totally, but you avoided the credibility of your strategy and also the trustworthiness. I think Steve touched at his first question about this very important problem, which is very closely connected to what you're doing. And I think most of us heard the message of Senator Obama yesterday in Berlin, and that was a very different message, because that was about bridge building. It was about trustworthiness. It was about regaining a good image of America abroad again. And so far, my question goes, are those two different strategies, which I heard today from you, yesterday from Senator Obama, Are they complementary or are they contradictory?
Thank you.
Well, I can't imagine anybody in the entire big, wide, wonderful world who disagrees with building bridges. I certainly don't. So I'm all in favor of what Senator Obama said. Senator Obama also said this: if we could win a battle of ideas against the communists, that may sound militaristic, if we could win a battle of ideas against the communists, we can stand with the vast majority of Muslims who reject the extremism that leads to hate instead of hope. So I don't think there's really that much, I don't think there's that much of a difference. Let me also say that in my personal dealings with our allies in Germany, in France, in the UK, we're on the same page here. Now, what I do agree with you to this extent. I don't like the term war of ideas. Let me just say that, even though I am the supreme Allied commander in the war of ideas.
Are you going to get in trouble for that?
What, for saying that?
I think that's a newsworthy line.
I don't think it's newsworthy because other practitioners who came before me also don't like the term and have tried to invent other terms. For example, global ideological engagement, that's one of them. My problem is I think everybody kind of knows what we're talking about when we say war of ideas, even though it's bellicose and it does have a kind of us versus them, which is really not what I'm talking about here. You know, when you look at the elements of the war of ideas, yes, we're pushing back against the ideology. You know, we're going to do what we can to encourage people who have more credibility than we do to undermine what is an ideology which, as I said, has the seeds of its own destruction. This is not really one of the great ideologies that's come along. Okay, but second, this diversion, which really is engagement, which really is bridge building. And I also, another thing that I didn't say in this talk, but I have frequently said is, look, you know, our objective is not to get people to be just like us. Not in the war of ideas. That's not what we want. Okay. We want one very simple thing. We want people to not be violent extremists. Whatever they choose in their lives, whatever particular course they want to take in a productive sense, that's their decision. We are facilitators. We are enablers. So I take your point. I think we're in agreement.
Bob Hutchings, former chairman of the National Intelligence Council.
Yeah, thanks very much. At Princeton University now, and former deputy director of Radio Free Europe way back early in my career. So I'm really going to echo the points that were made by the last two speakers. Mm-hmm. At Free Europe, I never considered myself in those 5 years as engaged in a battle with my audience or in a war of ideas with Soviet-style communism. That ideology was bankrupt and not worthy of a direct assault. And I think one of the reasons we were successful is we didn't set ourselves up in this adversarial way. You've already now said that you don't much like the term war of ideas. I would recommend that we do away with it at some point and get rid of the war on terror metaphor along with it. There's substance.
I don't think you, did you hear that term from me?
No, you didn't. I did.
Just wondering.
No. There's some substance here too, because I think when U.S. policy sets up this us versus them, you're either with us or you're against us, it makes it harder to have moderate Muslims take our side. If the choice is our side or theirs, they're going to stay on the other side. So I think even though it's just a term, I think it does have a damaging effect.
You know, I couldn't agree with you more. The fact is, it's not, the guys who say it's us versus them are the bad guys, okay? Now maybe, you know, forgive me for saying bad guys, but they have this Manichaean view of the world. There's good, which is us, Al-Qaeda, or those who support us, and then there's evil, which is everybody else, including certain Muslims. That is not our view. It really isn't. Our view is the one I just expressed, which is to say, we don't care. We think that in the end that we have the confidence to believe that in the end people will choose, let's call them Enlightenment values, tolerance, you know, critical thinking, the values that sort of surround free choice and that sort of thing. And so we want to be a facilitator, let people move in those directions. We are not setting, we don't believe in the war of ideas. We don't believe in this dichotomy. And I agree with you that the term itself is a problem. And I'm ready to listen to anybody.
We should have a salon dinner
my
on
view,
rebranding.
However, we don't have. Here's the deal. Here's the deal. We don't have time to rebrand. People have said, "Oh, you got to restructure. You got to do this." No, we did some reorganization. I've got 6 months. Maybe some new president will keep me on or something. But I figure this is a 6-month job. So we don't have time to change the terms. We have work to do, and we're out doing it. I would also just one quick thing about Radio Free Europe. I don't really see Radio Free Europe's role as being part of this battle that I described. I am a great believer in U.S. international broadcasting. I've stood up for it for the last year against some really pretty strong assaults about people who wanted it to do things that it's not made to do. It is not in the propaganda business. It's not in the advocacy business. Those of us at the State Department are in the advocacy business in a lot of what we do. But RFE is not in that business. Neither is VOA, and there should be no doubt about that. U.S. international broadcasting is there to explain U.S. policies, I think, in a vigorous, robust way, but also show different points of view, as well as in countries that don't have a free press, to show actually what's going on in those countries to the people who live there, like people in Tibet and people in Burma who are sealed off from knowing about what's happening in their own country. And I would also add Cuba to that.
Howard LaFranchi.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to get back to specifically this question of, well, it sounds like you're shifting things away from a focus on explaining U.S. policy, because I've been covering this public diplomacy effort since 9/11, and what I've always heard, under the whether it was Hughes, Beers, going back, it was always, well, we can't change policy, but it's our job to explain it. And it sounded like a real shift, a very new direction that you're talking about, and I'm wondering how you arrived at that, and also, but if you really think that that you can advance when U.S. policy in many ways, in many areas, is so unpopular.
Well, the answer to your last question is yes, 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 we can advance, even though U.S. policy is unpopular, and that's because in the war of ideas, U.S. policy is not particularly relevant. I wouldn't say it's completely irrelevant. It's true that we do ask for cooperation from people who might be less likely to give it to us because they don't like what we're, that they perceive that we have a bias toward the Israelis, or they don't like the war in Iraq and so forth. Let me be really clear on this, okay? The way I described it in my talk is a shift in focus and emphasis, okay? We are not, by any means, giving up in public diplomacy on explaining U.S. policy. We spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of effort in doing that. That's what international information programs are all about. If you go to america.gov, that's what you'll see. If you read our e-journals, which are fantastic, that's what you'll see. We have speakers who go abroad and talk about that. And I absolutely believe that a lot of American policies have been misrepresented by people who have a good reason to misrepresent them. So we need to do a better job of explaining those policies, and maybe even more important, explaining what America itself is all about. So we are not backing off of that at all. What I'm saying is a shift in focus and emphasis. Part of it, okay, let's be honest, is kind of personal, because this is what I've spent my life doing, is doing the kinds of things that have prepared me for this job. I sort of know war of ideas stuff through journalism and through my think tank work. So this is really how I can contribute. And what we've done is we have added, I think, a very important third leg. It existed before, but we're adding emphasis and focus on the war of ideas in addition to international information programs and our very, very important education and cultural affairs department, which spends the majority of the money that we have. So let's not forget that.
This gentleman.
Gordon Johnson, retired Center for Privatization and retired businessman. Thinking of your past background, which you just mentioned, it would seem that money would be an important part of what we do, and in terms of a diversion, isn't the way the oil money spent an issue that could be a diversion, because extremists take money. The mission takes, we need to change not only minds, but change the way money is spent, and perhaps convincing people or finding ways that they will see how the money is spent, showing them how the money is spent, will help change the way it goes to bad purposes.
Did you have the authority to change the way money's spent?
I'm not really sure. You mean the way money's spent in the
No.
in the government?
I think the question is focused on, as I know that the general direction I've written about it is, your interest is in states in the Middle East in particular that have oil revenue. Why aren't we working to meddle in their domestic circumstances to, yeah.
Influence how the people, if they knew
Right.
all the money, if they knew how much money was going there instead of for schools or hospitals, that
I see.
knowledge could help.
Well, I completely agree with you, and I think it's not just oil. I think it's
Right.
also nuclear programs in countries like Iran. I think if the Iranian people were to make the decision themselves, they might not be spending money on supporting Arab terrorists and spending money on building a $30 billion nuclear program, and instead would lift up their economy. I mean, here you've got people who are among the most creative, and imaginative, diligent, best educated people in the world with a rich cultural history, and they've got a rotten economy at a time when oil, last time I looked, was over $120 a barrel, and they've got the third largest oil reserves in the world. What's going on there? So, I agree.
I mean, these transparency initiatives are important. Grover Norquist, who's here with today, has been doing a lot of this also in U.S. states and governments sort of publishing these kinds of arrangements. So there's a great more deal of transparency, but also states with other kinds of resource, diamond states, et cetera. Ben Wattenberg?
Yeah, excuse me, Jim and Steve, you hear the argument made increasingly that we ought to pursue the war against al-Qaeda in Afghanistan because that's where 9/11 happened, but that Iraq is a diversion. And it seems to me that the obvious answer, which I rarely hear given, is that if you are going to have a war on terror, which we have, and it's been, I mean, nobody would have believed after 9/11 that America wouldn't be hit again. It's partly luck, but partly very creative diplomacy all over the world, that we ought to be making the point that if you're going to have a war on terror, you go after terrorists, whether or not there was a link between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, and that that Saddam Hussein clearly was a terrorist. I mean, he sent money to the PLO bombers. He tried to kill the first President Bush. We have lots and lots of evidence about that. We also have evidence that he did pursue weapons of mass destruction. And we had investigating teams there. We have him on tape as saying, a few months before he was killed, telling his subalterns to pursue the program. So it seems to me that is a good rhetorical point to make, which I rarely hear made, which is terrorists are indivisible. They're terrorists.
Thanks, Ben.
I don't. My good friend Ben, I have no comment. Your
You there?
Your
Let
eloquence precedes me.
me go to Kathy. You need the microphone. Yeah.
I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on what, if any, priorities you've focused on in the last 6 months in Pakistan and in Afghanistan for public diplomacy, particularly and obviously in the Northwest tribal areas.
So Pakistan and Afghanistan tribal areas.
Very difficult in Pakistan, as you can imagine. You know, it's hard to put in programs in, especially in the FATA and other dangerous areas, because they're so dangerous. I mean, really, what we're focused on right now, and we do have programs in Pakistan. We have actually a very interesting one that I was just told about yesterday, that involves young people doing radio programs. Really neat program, and we can tell you a lot more about that if you'd like to know. But just very quickly, we are focused on foreign fighters. We want to divert foreign fighters from coming into Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is what's happening now. I mean, there's some indigenous people, but basically what you've got is people from other countries, mainly Arab countries, doing that. So that's our focus.
Have you talked to one of our fellows that I basically purloined after he was expelled from Pakistan was Nicholas Schmidl, who wrote the article in the New York Times Magazine called Next Gen Taliban. One of the interesting things about it is he would go in as this blonde-haired kid and meet with lots of youthful people in the tribal areas, and he could pretty much get a sense that there weren't any other blonde kids running around or people there, and you realize that there weren't a lot
That's
of
a relief.
a lot of there wasn't a lot of presence anyway. From either Europe or the United States, but nonetheless, he was conversing with these people. But I guess part of my question, it's not to put you on the spot, is that there are people who've done this to sort of, who've had experiences, who I think now in think tank settings are out there. Are you meeting with them, or do you have staff that are basically trying to sponge up some of the experiences of the Bergens plus?
Absolutely. I really feel that one of the things we're trying to do, others can decide whether we're succeeding in doing this, is really reaching out to the kind of intellectual community and trying to build a stronger intellectual base for what we're doing. And this is just really important to me, and it comes from my think tank training. We have a wonderful guy in your description of the blonde-haired person. He's not blonde, but at the State Department named Jared Cohen, who's written a couple of books about his experiences with young people. One I think was about Africa, but his most recent book is his travels in the Muslim world, and he is very much in touch with the kinds of people that you're talking about, but so are we. I mean, I really spend a lot of my time talking to people and reading and really kind of learning about the best information available on this. I think that's
yes,
good
this
use of
gentleman
my
right
time.
here. If you folks will continue to identify yourselves, I appreciate it.
Bob Shadler. I'm Senior Fellow in Public Diplomacy at the American Foreign Policy Council and spent over 10 years at the U.S. Information Agency. Thank you very much for your talk and your service. And my question, I think, follows on some of the others. You said that it's the Manichaean we-they divide which is the enemy, and we need to avoid it. And yet, there were at times we and they cropping up in your comments. So my questions are about we and they. We, Americans, include many millions of American Muslims, many thousands of whom are highly educated, fluent in Arabic, and patriotic. And so a more comprehensive, fuller, and focused use of them might be part of who we are and might be a part of we who are credible in that region. With regard to they, we know a lot of terrorists in the world are not Islamic, and some Islamic terrorists are not focused on the United States. And I'm interested in whether our war on terrorism is focused on them as well, or are we primarily interested in violence and terrorism against us and American assets? And
I got to cut it off there.
Okay.
Thanks.
Just a comment. Your comment about non-Muslim violent extremists. I agree with that, and I mentioned that. Maybe I just mentioned it in passing, and I should put more emphasis on it. We are very much concerned, and in fact, in building networks, we think that there's a common cause among, for example, victims of the FARC and victims of terrorism in, say, the Middle East. As far as using American Muslims, not using American Muslims, but having American Muslims reach out, we're doing that. And we're doing that in a pretty robust way. We do have programs that bring American Muslims to other parts of the world. They are very eager. American Muslims are very eager to participate in such programs. Just to give you one example, we had a conference, this was last year, it may have been the year before, and we're thinking about doing this again, where we brought American Muslims to Brussels to meet with European Muslims. So we're doing that as much as we can, and I think that's a very good piece of advice.
I know I've spoken to Keith Ellison, the first Muslim member. I think there's a second now member of Congress who's been very active with the State Department's efforts in there.
Let me actually,
yeah.
can I say something
Yeah.
really quickly about American Muslims? If you read the research, Pew has done research, others have done research. It's very interesting. You know, American Muslims, first of all, are highly successful. Very different, let's say, Pakistani Americans from Pakistanis immigrants in Britain. Okay, but they, much more than Americans as a whole, oppose our policies in Iraq by like 10, 12 to 1, I mean, way off the charts, and oppose our policies toward Israel and the Palestinians. And yet, they completely buy in to American values. Not only do they support American values, they engage in them, they act them every day. They believe in the kinds of things that all Americans believe in, and not just Americans, obviously, the kinds of values that I've been talking about. And to me, that's a pretty good model for the rest of the world. You know, we don't require that everyone agrees with our policies. It'd be nice if they did, but that's not a requirement. That it is kind of respectful disagreement. As I said, that these disagreements, these animosities, do not become violent extremism or support for violent extremism. And that's what you have in the American Muslim community, that kind of situation, which is a wonderful thing, I think.
The lady in red.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
You need to hold it right up to your mouth and speak loudly.
Like this?
Thanks. Yeah.
And hey, good with Lena Production.
And keep it right up at your mouth.
Okay.
You're moving your arm around.
All right. Like
Makes
this?
it very difficult.
My question is very short. I just want to know, how do you suggest empowering credible Muslim voices in countries where there is severe restriction on freedom of expression, where the threat of Islamists has been used previously to empower those regimes?
It's harder, but it certainly can be done. And I think that most of those governments, I can sort of guess which ones you're talking about, agree that those credible voices need to be empowered. You know, they may have different views about how threatening they might be, but in general, I think there is more and more across the Middle East, certainly, a belief that empowerment is absolutely necessary. And, you know, we can do what we can to exhort and encourage. By the way, I know that Senator Obama gave a speech that was had a lot of people turned out to hear it yesterday in Berlin. The President of the United States also gave a very good speech yesterday about
a lot of people show up.
About some of these. Well, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's what you say rather than whether. Sometimes the. Well, anyway, I don't need to get into that. I'm not political. I'm not political. But one of the things he said was how important it was to encourage pro-democracy voices, pro-freedom voices, pro-voices that have these values that we have, that we believe in countries that are that suppress such things. And he named the countries, and so I think we're trying to do that.
Guys, I'm not going to be able to take all the questions, but in the very back.
My name is Alan Nichols. You said that these extremists are twisting a peaceful and wonderful religion. Could you please elaborate on that and also mention what are the Saudis doing to promote peace and understanding and liberality in the world? Thank you.
Well, I could get into the complicated ideology that Al-Qaeda has managed to come up with, but you know, there's been a movement in Islam called Salafism, which is essentially a return to the roots of the religion. You know, people call it fundamentalism, but it's really more than that. Originalism, very good. Okay, and you know, frankly, I don't have any problem with Salafism. It's not for me to make decisions about that. But from that has been built something else, which is very pernicious, is a kind of takfirism, which is the idea that that I, as a member of Al-Qaeda, as a chosen group, or this specific group, can decide that you are not a true Muslim, and I can excommunicate you, and it's perfectly fine for me to kill you. And not just you, but anyone around you, supporters of you. So I think, without getting into a lot of epistemological discussion here, I think it's pretty clear what what this particular ideology is built on. It is not Islam as practiced by the vast majority of Muslims around the world. It is a particular twisted, as I said, parasitic kind of ideology that's based on a religion.
I should add here something New American Foundation is trying to do with the Saudi government, is trying to get the Saudis to release something that is not classified, but it is an interesting set of behavioral research done on various captured or returning jihadis and others that were involved that deal exactly with this takfir question and other motivations, and that separate the worst players in this from those that were maybe more religiously motivated and inspired. And it's a fascinating, I think what you're doing is very important, because in the Saudi research that I was briefed on, it's very interesting that the worst players were not, in fact, religiously motivated other. They were a special kind of criminal, and it's very sophisticated research. But as you move down and look at the exploitation of these questions, and this takfir question came up. So I think it's in their interest to have this out there, and so I'm trying to convince them to put it out publicly, and when we do, we'll ask Peter Bergen to participate in that, but I wanted to emphasize this. Yes, very quickly, you've got, yes, go ahead. You've got 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. 30 seconds. I
Yeah,
think
30
I can
seconds.
do that. Mr. Glassman, there's a new House Resolution 1308, authored by a Florida congressman, in which he proposes in the resolution to blacklist several television stations coming out of the Middle East, including Al-Alam and Press Television. I'd like to know what the head of public diplomacy, I got 2 more seconds, feels about the blacklisting of competing services to Voice of America, Al Hurra, etc. 30 seconds.
I think I've actually know nothing about that bill. I can tell you one thing, though. We make an effort in U.S. international broadcasting to broadcast not propaganda, but balanced, objective news throughout the world in 60 languages. Many countries that we in the United States are perfectly welcoming of their media, perfectly welcoming to their media, try to block us, and not even try to block us. They arrest our people. In some cases, they kill our people, and this is a very upsetting situation. And you know, so it's kind of funny that you should bring that up, the notion of being blacklisted. I mean, for example, we would like to broadcast into Iran without being blocked, without having actually, let's put it this way. I think the Iranian people should be allowed to own satellite dishes on their own. To go to the store, buy a satellite dish, and be exposed to the full range of opinion around the world, including VOA Persian TV, but gosh, you know, they can listen to whatever they want. They can watch whatever they want. They can't do that now. Same thing with the people in Cuba, and same thing with people around. It's hard to believe that still goes on around the world. It goes on in China, where where signals are jammed routinely, where we are not able to get internet signals in. So the idea that the United States is blacklisting anybody, I must say that if there are problems in the United States, they are minor compared to what's going on in the rest of the world.
I need to bring the meeting to a close. I apologize to everyone who had a question. There are a lot of great questions out there, but I've got 2 personal things I'm going to stick in real quick because they're unfair and out of the
they're unfair.
They're unfair in a way because I'm jumping out of this war of ideas, but it's an interesting set of questions because you've been an entrepreneurial player, a straight shooter in so many different areas. You and I have a mutual friend who's Poland's foreign minister now. Radek Sikorski used to have the New Atlantic Initiative. And Radek wrote a really great article on one occasion that dealt with the fact of Cuba. You mentioned Cuba. And said, you know, if you want to basically change a society, open new currents, basically let people meet, exchange goods, ideas, etc., which I totally support. We happen to be doing an event, same room, same place, time on Monday, called What Richard Nixon Would Do with Cuba. And I know that you wrote at one point something quite similar to Radek Sikorski's thinking. And I don't want to put in, I actually don't necessarily want you to comment, but
I will comment.
Yeah, okay.
I will comment.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be very focused in my comments because I know a lot about.
And I don't want to get you fired.
I know a lot about
so.
Cuba. No, I'm not going to get fired for this.
Yeah. Okay.
Look, the business about whether we should trade with Cuba and all that, fine. People can discuss that. I'm not going to take I support the administration's position. But the idea that the Cuban people are being sealed off from the rest of the world, that they can't listen to what they want on the radio, they can't watch television. I mean, there are I understand there are 50,000, that's all, satellite dishes in Cuba that are completely illegal. I think the Cuban people should be able to watch what they want on satellite television. They should be able to have internet connections with the rest of the world, which they are not allowed to now. Raul Castro says, okay, you can buy a computer, but you can't hook it up to the internet. I think the Cuban people should be open to the world, and that doesn't necessarily mean the United States is going to gain from that or not. But the Cuban people will certainly gain from that. So that's what I would like to see.
Well, I appreciate your views, and I appreciate your leadership on this in other roles you've had. But finally, because it's very important, this student issue about students going across borders is so important that that bringing people from other countries into the United States. And I think there is a positive story to tell. There's also lots of aggregated stories that aren't quite as nice, particularly border issues. And it seems to me that we as a nation, like all nations, reserve the right to reject people coming into the country on visas. But when you look at the non-visa waivered countries, we charge somewhere of about $135 for that visa application. And lots of these are rejected. And it seems to me, and this may be out of your bailiwick as well, but I'd like to encourage you to take it back to Secretary Rice, and I would like to see Congress consider it, a refund of that money if we reject them. Take $100 and put it back in the hands of the people we said no to. That kind of gesture and magnanimity might in fact be something that could create positive currents that could help other parts of your portfolio move more swimmingly.
I will take that back, and let me tell you, these cross-border issues definitely affect us. We spend a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money on bringing people to the United States, and they get held up at the border and are in some cases mistreated, and that's a big problem. Now, I absolutely understand that we have to balance these security issues, and I think the security issues are tremendously important. I'm not being critical of what we're doing, but I'm just saying that you're right that a lot of what we do can be undone if there are really unwarranted abuses. It's one thing to keep people out who deserve to be kept out. I mean, this is a dangerous situation, a dangerous world that we live in. But despite that, as I said, more than 600,000 foreign students are coming to the United States. That was the 2007-2008 academic year. We expect more in the year after, so that's good. Can I say one last thing?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I've done, as Steve pointed out, I've done a lot of things in my life. This is the most rewarding thing I've ever done, and I just feel that serving my country is enormously rewarding at this particular moment in history. I mean, I'm also able to kind of have a view of how government works that I never had when I was outside government. But I would just, urge all of you, especially young people who are here, that to think about government as, whether you agree with the particular policies of an administration today or not, as something you might want to do during one time in your life, or maybe your whole life. So thank you all for listening.
I'd like to say, just in thanks to Jim Glassman, that if there's anyone that I know in Washington that can get something done in 6 to 7 months, it's James Glassman. So we look forward to that. Thank you.
We'll see about that.
Thanks so much.